The morning Maria Morgan rode into Caldwell, Kansas. She had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a letter of employment from the Caldwell schoolhouse tucked beneath her saddle, and a bruise along her jaw that she had no intention of explaining to anyone. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle trails were still alive with the sounds of longhorn hooves and drovers shouting across the flat, wind-bitten prairie. Caldwell itself sat close to the Kansas Indian Territory border like a man leaning against a fence post, half weary, half watching. It was a boom town with a short temper and a long memory, and strangers did not typically arrive without being noticed, questioned, or offered a drink they had not asked for. Maria noticed all of it the moment she turned her horse, a dun mare she called Rosie, down the main road. The wide dirt street was already churning with activity even at mid-morning. A freight wagon was pulled alongside the general store, its driver arguing prices with the storekeeper through the open door. 3 drovers sat outside the Lone Star Saloon on overturned crates, their boots dusty and their eyes slow and appraising. A dog ran beneath the legs of a horse tied at the hitching post, and the horse did not bother to flinch. She rode with her back straight and her chin level, because she had learned early that the way you carried yourself told people what you expected from them. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes that had seen enough disappointment to know better than to be surprised by it. She had come from Wichita, where a man named Gerald had promised her a future and delivered instead 2 years of careful misery before she found the courage to leave it all behind. The schoolhouse was at the north end of town, a modest white-painted building with a bell that needed ringing and a yard that needed clearing. The woman who had hired her by letter, a Mrs. Eleanor Dowd, was the wife of one of the town's founding businessmen, and she met Maria at the door with flour on her apron and a warmth in her manner that felt like the first honest welcome Maria had received in a long time. "You look like you could use a proper meal before anything else," Eleanor said, looking at Maria the way a woman looks at another woman when she sees something she recognizes. "I could use to see the schoolhouse first," Maria said, "then the meal." Eleanor smiled as though this answer pleased her considerably. The school had 22 students ranging from 6 to 14, and a small attached room at the back where Maria would sleep. It was nothing grand. There was a wood stove that drew unevenly and a chalk supply that would not last past summer, but the windows faced east and the light in the mornings was golden and generous, and Maria decided within 10 minutes that she would stay. That first week passed in the work of settling. Maria cataloged what books she had, organized what supplies existed, wrote careful letters requesting donations from the church and the town council, and began introducing herself to the families whose children she would be teaching. Most of the women she met were cautious but kind. Most of the men were polite in the way men in small towns are polite to women who hold some form of official standing respectfully and from a distance. She heard the name Orville Archer on her 4th day, when she went to the lumber yard on the east edge of town to ask about the cost of a new bookshelf for the school. The man at the lumber yard, a round-faced fellow named Hector Birch, told her before she had even finished asking that Orville Archer was the man she wanted. "Best woodworker in the county," Hector said. "Does furniture, does structural, does whatever needs doing. Got a place about 2 miles east of town on the road toward Medicine Lodge. Can't miss it. Got a covered porch facing the road. Is he fair in his pricing?" Maria asked because she had exactly the $4 and a few cents she had arrived with and whatever the town council would agree to spend. Hector scratched the back of his neck. "He's fair. He's also quiet. Don't let the quiet put you off. That's just how he is." Maria thanked him and rode out east that same afternoon, because she was not the sort of woman who waited when a thing needed doing. The property appeared as Hector had described it, a modest but well-built homestead set back from the road about 50 yards, with a stand of cottonwood trees along the eastern edge that cast long afternoon shadows across a vegetable garden running neat as a soldier's bunk. The house itself was single-story, made of good solid timber, with a covered porch that faced the road. And on that porch, one chair sat alone, a wide-backed wooden chair with carved armrests made by careful hands. She noticed it with no particular significance at that moment. One chair. A man living alone. Orville Archer was in the yard beside the house when she arrived, working a length of pine with a drawn knife. His sleeves rolled past his elbows. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that had been cut with more practicality than vanity. He looked up when she dismounted and watched her with the calm attention of a man who was rarely surprised but was not unwilling to be. "Mr. Archer," she said, looping Rosie's reins around the hitching post by the gate. "My name is Maria Morgan. I'm the new schoolteacher. I was told you might be the person to speak with about a bookshelf." He set down the drawn knife and straightened. "Heard there was a new teacher coming," he said. His voice was even unhurried. "Didn't know it would be a woman." "Does that change anything about the bookshelf?" she asked. He considered this for exactly 2 seconds. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "Come and tell me what you need." They stood in the afternoon light, and she described what she was imagining: shelves tall enough for reference materials, wide enough for double stacking, sturdy enough to survive children who were not always gentle. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he nodded once and gave her a price that was lower than she had expected. "That seems less than it ought to be," she said. "It's the school," he said simply, and she understood from the way he said it that this was not charity and not flattery. It was a value he held, that education was worth putting something toward. She said she would bring him payment when the shelves were complete, and he agreed to have them ready within the week. She thanked him, untied Rosie, and rode back toward town. She did not think about him particularly on the ride home. She thought about the school, and the children she would meet on Monday, and whether the stove could be fixed before the next cold snap. But she thought about the chair on the porch, in the way you sometimes turn over something small and unremarkable in your mind without knowing why. Monday arrived with the chaos and wonder of first days. 22 children filed in, ranging from a 6-year-old girl named Bess Whitmore who clutched her slate board with both hands and stared at Maria with the total openness of someone encountering something they had no frame for, to a 14-year-old boy named Samuel Crane who sat in the back row with his arms crossed, and a look that said he had decided before arrival that none of this applied to him. Maria handled them all. She had a way with children that was neither soft nor harsh, a quality of taking them entirely seriously while also finding the humor in everything. And by the end of the first morning, even Samuel Crane had lowered his arms. The shelves arrived on Wednesday, delivered by Orville himself in his wagon, and they were beautiful. Not ostentatious, but precisely what she had described, with clean lines and even spacing and a finish that would hold up to decades of use. She ran her hand along one of the shelves and felt the smoothness of the wood and said, "Honestly, these are very well made." "I try to do the thing right," he said, which was not a boast but simply a statement of his own standard. He helped her carry them in and position them along the east wall, and while they worked she found herself asking him small things: how long he had been in Caldwell, where he had come from, how he had learned his trade. He answered each question with the same unhurried economy he brought to everything else. He had been in Caldwell 4 years. He had come from Missouri, from a farm family with more children than land, which meant he had needed to learn a skill or starve, and carpentry had come naturally. He had a gift for seeing the finished shape inside a raw piece of wood. "And you?" he asked, setting the second shelf into place. "Wichita," she said. "Before that, Ohio. I've been moving west for about 6 years. Teaching all that time. Teaching and other things," she said, which was all she intended to say on the matter. He did not press, and she noticed that. He left when the shelves were in place and she had pressed the payment into his hand. He paused at the door and looked back at the room, the shelves now anchoring the east wall with a kind of solidity that the room had lacked before, and something in his expression suggested he was pleased not by the compliment but by the finished work itself. "Good luck on Thursday," he said, and she realized he had remembered that Thursday was when school opened to full attendance. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left. Maria stood in the doorway and watched his wagon disappear down the road and thought, without any particular alarm, that he was an interesting man. The weeks that followed were full. She had 22 students to bring along, a community to integrate herself into, and a town with all the ordinary drama of a cattle trail settlement. There were disputes over land and water rights being argued in the saloon at volumes that drifted down the street. There were 2 cattle drives that passed through in April, filling the town overnight with drovers who were loud and spending money as though it would expire, before moving on again with their dust, and their noise leaving the town quieter and richer. There was a church social in early May that Maria attended because Eleanor Dowd insisted, and at which she was introduced to more people than she could possibly remember, and was asked by no fewer than 4 separate women whether she had a husband. She said no each time with such complete equanimity that it put the questions to rest. Orville Archer was at the church social briefly. He arrived, spoke to several people including the minister and a rancher named Caldwell Pete, which was apparently what everyone called him rather than his actual name, and left within the hour. Maria watched him move through the social the way he did everything, without hurry, without performance, fully present but not seeking anything from the crowd. She had seen him 3 times since the shelves. Once in the general store, where they had exchanged a few words about a book she was trying to order for the school. Once on the road east of town, when she was riding out to visit one of her students' families, and he was coming back from the timber merchant. And once at the edge of the schoolyard, when she had been clearing brush after the children had gone home, and he had stopped his wagon to ask if she needed help with the larger branches. She had said yes, because the larger branches genuinely needed someone with more leverage than she had, and he had tied his horse and spent 20 minutes working alongside her without a word about it. When the brush was cleared, she had thanked him and offered him coffee from the pot on the school stove, and he had accepted, and they had stood outside in the cooling evening and talked for perhaps half an hour about things that mattered and things that did not, the reliability of the spring rains, whether the cattle boom would last, what she thought of Kansas after Ohio, what books he kept on his own shelf. He read. This surprised her, or rather it surprised her that it surprised her. She had formed no particular expectation of him, but somehow the image of him reading by lantern light in the evenings seemed to open a door in her sense of him. "What do you read?" she asked. "History mostly," he said. "Some natural philosophy, whatever I can get from Mrs. Clayton's lending shelf. There was a woman in town, a widow, who had brought an impressive number of books from back east and had taken to lending them informally." "Have you read Darwin?" Maria asked. "I have," he said. Disagreed with half of it and found the other half worth arguing over. He said this with a dry precision that made her laugh, and the laugh surprised her because it came so easily. He smiled at the sound of it, not broadly, but genuinely, the way a man smiles when something good has happened. They finished their coffee and he left, and she washed the cups and prepared for the next day's lesson and went to bed thinking about what he had said about Darwin, and about the way he had smiled. The trouble arrived in early June, as trouble in cattle towns often did, and with very little warning. His name was Bernard Holt, and he was a land speculator from Topeka who had been buying up homestead claims in the county for the past 2 years, sometimes legitimately and sometimes through pressures that the law was not quite ready to call illegal, but that everyone in the territory recognized as something other than fair. He had already forced 3 families off their land north of town through a combination of inflated debt and threatened foreclosure. The Crane family, Samuel Crane's family, was the latest to receive one of his letters. Maria learned about it from Samuel himself, who arrived at school on a Tuesday morning in June with a gray, sealed expression that told her something had gone wrong at home. She kept him after the others left and asked him directly, because she had learned that Samuel responded to directness much better than to careful coaxing. He told her about the letter. His father owed $200 to a holding company out of Topeka, a debt he had taken on 3 years ago to buy seed after a bad crop. The holding company had sold the debt to Bernard Holt, and Holt was now demanding full payment within 60 days or the property would be seized. "Can your father pay it?" Maria asked. "No," Samuel said. "Not in 60 days, maybe not in 60 months. That evening, Maria went to see Alina Dowd and asked what she knew about Holt. Alina knew quite a bit, none of it reassuring. Holt had legal standing in most of what he did. He operated through the edges of the law with the particular skill of a man who had made a study of where those edges were. "Is there anyone who's been able to stop him?" Maria asked. Alina was quiet for a moment. "Orville Archer told him off 2 years ago," she said. "Holt tried to buy his land claim. Orville refused, and when Holt sent men to pressure him, Orville walked into town and had a very public conversation with the county marshal about exactly what Holt's men had done and said. Put the whole thing on the record. Holt backed off." Maria thanked Alina and rode out east the next morning before school. She found Orville at his workbench behind the house, fitting a mortise joint with the focused attention he brought to everything. He looked up when he heard her horse, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as though her arrival was unexpected and also somehow not unwelcome. "I need to ask your advice," she said without preamble, because she was not a woman who softened requests unnecessarily. He set down the wood and the mallet. "Come sit," he said, gesturing to the porch. She tied Rosie and followed him to the porch, where the single chair waited in the morning light. He brought a stool from inside and set it beside the chair, then sat on the stool and gestured her to the chair. She sat, and for a moment the arrangement struck her, him on the lower seat, her on the chair, the easy informality of it, and she filed it away without comment. She told him about the Crane family, about the letter, about what Alina had said of his own history with Holt. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he listened to things that required actual thought. "He's been careful since the Marshall incident," Orville said when she finished. "But careful doesn't mean stopped." "What can the family do?" she asked. "They need a lawyer," he said. "There's a man in Wichita, James Aldred, who has handled 2 of Holt's other cases. One of the families kept their land. He knows the law well enough to find the corners Holt uses and get ahead of them." "That costs money," Maria said. "It does," Orville said. "But Aldred will sometimes defer payment if he believes the case is worth his time." They talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time she rode back to school she had a plan, which was to write to James Aldred and to organize a quiet collection among the townspeople who had the most reason to want Holt checked. Orville offered to contribute to the collection himself, and when she tried to say he did not have to, he looked at her with a patience that settled the matter without argument. The next weeks were busy with the campaign on behalf of the Crane family and with the ordinary work of school, which was in no way ordinary. Maria found herself thinking often in the space of those weeks about how the work she was doing and the work Orville was doing, separately, in different parts of the same effort, seemed to fit together as though they had been designed to. He knew the legal and land ownership landscape. She knew the people, the community, the children. Together they assembled a picture of Holt's methods that was more complete than either could have built alone. They met 3 more times in that span, once at the Dowd house for a dinner Alina arranged, and at which Orville was also a guest, once on the road when they happened to be heading the same direction and fell into easy companionship for the 2 miles they shared, and once when he came to the school with a small repair. She had not asked for a loose hinge on the front door, which he fixed in 10 minutes and then did not appear to expect any particular acknowledgement for. "You did not need to do that," she said. "The door would have come off eventually," he said. "Better now." She watched him gather his tools and thought that this was a man for whom care was not a performance. It was simply how he moved through the world. James Aldred responded to her letter within 2 weeks and agreed to take the Crane case on deferred payment. He was able to establish that Holt's acquisition of the debt had included an interest calculation that exceeded the legal limit under Kansas law, making the entire foreclosure demand invalid. The process took the better part of 2 months, through July and into August, during which the Crane family existed in a state of anxious suspension, but in the end the foreclosure was voided. When Maria told Samuel at school, the boy sat very still for a long moment and then stood up and said, "Thank you, Miss Morgan," in a voice that was working hard to remain steady. She thought she would always remember that moment. The summer heat in Kansas in 1878 was of the committed, relentless variety that makes you understand why people describe it in terms of warfare. It arrived in July and took possession of everything: the fields, the roads, the schoolroom, despite every window thrown open. Maria had grown up with Ohio summers, which were humid and thick, but this was a different heat, dry and absolute, that pressed down from a sky so blue it looked painted. She rode out in the evenings when she could, because the evenings cooled quickly once the sun descended, and the land in that golden hour before dusk had a beauty so uncomplicated it almost hurt to look at it. She rode east, because east of town the land opened up into the wide grass prairie broken by cottonwood stands along the seasonal creek beds, and it felt like space, like breath. One evening in late July, she came along the road past Orville Archer's property and saw him on the porch. He raised a hand. She slowed and then stopped, and then dismounted and tied Rosie to the gate. "Evening," he said. He had a book open on his knee but had been looking at the sunset rather than reading it. "Evening," she said. "I'm not intruding." "No," he said simply, without the social performance of insisting she was welcome. "Just, no, you are not intruding." She leaned against the porch railing and they watched the sunset together and talked about very little the quality of the light, a question she had about his vegetable garden which was producing an unusual abundance of squash, whether the fall would come early or late. The conversation was easy in the way that some conversations are easy, not because effort is absent, but because effort has become something neither party has to think about. She rode home in the first dark and sat on the step outside her room at the school and held the warmth of the evening like something she did not want to put down. She began stopping on her evening rides more frequently. Not every evening, not even close to every evening, but perhaps once or twice a week when the direction of her ride took her past his gate, she would stop and they would talk in the slowly cooling air. Sometimes she brought a book she thought he might like to borrow. Sometimes he had made coffee and handed her a cup through the porch railing without being asked, as though her arrival had been factored into the evening's arrangements. She asked him once in August about the single chair on the porch. "Did you ever want to build a second one?" she asked, not entirely sure why she was asking. He looked at the chair. Then he looked at her. "I've thought about it," he said. She did not know what to do with the way he said it, so she looked at the sunset and they talked about other things, and she rode home with her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. August moved into September with the specific beauty of early fall on the Kansas plains, when the heat breaks and the grass goes golden, and the sky turns a deeper, more serious blue. The cattle drives had thinned out. The town was settling toward its winter self, slower and more internal. The school was back in full session after its brief summer reduction, and Maria was preparing a harvest program for the end of October that involved every student and most of the town. Orville came to school one afternoon in early September not for any specific purpose she could identify, but said he had heard about the harvest program and offered to build a small stage platform that could be used for the performance and afterward stored flat under the school for future events. She said yes because the idea was a good one, and also because she had learned to accept his offers at their value, which was what they were: practical generosity, no more and no less complicated than that. He spent 3 afternoons that week working on the platform in the schoolyard while she taught, and she found herself more than once pausing in a lesson to look out the window at where he was working, feeling something in her chest that she had not allowed herself to name yet, but that had been building since April with the steady patience of something that intended to be there when she finally turned to look at it. On the third afternoon, she brought him coffee when the children had gone home and sat on the school steps while he fitted the final boards. They talked about the program, which songs the children were learning, which of her students had the most natural confidence in front of an audience. Samuel Crane, she said, without hesitation. He has the presence of a person who was born knowing that what he has to say is worth hearing. Orville set a nail and drove it with 2 clean strokes. His father's like that, he said. Steady man, good neighbor, a pause. I'm glad his family kept their land. So am I, she said. He straightened and looked at the finished platform, testing it with his weight, pressing down on each corner to check the evenness. Satisfied, he turned and looked at her sitting on the steps in the afternoon light, and she looked back, and there was a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained something that both of them understood and neither of them acknowledged. I'll come the night of the program, he said, if you don't mind. I don't mind at all, she said. Come early. I'll need help getting the platform into position. He nodded. She thought his expression, always so settled and contained, had something in it that was a degree warmer than usual, but she was not certain, and she was not ready yet to be certain. The days shortened. The harvest program came together in the way that school programs do, through imperfect rehearsals and moments of pure inspired chaos, through arguments among the children about who stood where, through the extraordinary transformation that occurs when the actual night arrives and children who could not remember their lines yesterday discover that the audience fills them up with something they did not know they had. 2 days before the harvest program, Maria rode out east in the afternoon on an errand to visit the Whitmore farm, where little Bess Whitmore had been home sick with a chest cold, and Maria was bringing her a lesson packet to keep up with her reading. The Whitmores lived a mile past Orville's property, and she passed his gate on the way there and on the way back. On the way back, she saw it. She almost missed it. The afternoon light was coming low, and she was thinking about the program, running through the list of what still needed doing, and she almost looked past the porch entirely. But something made her look. There were 2 chairs. 2 chairs on the porch, set side by side, facing the road and the prairie and the enormous Kansas sky. Both made of the same good wood, both with the same careful construction, both with that particular quality she had come to associate with everything Orville built, made to last, made with intention. He had built a second chair. She pulled Rosie to a stop in the road and looked at those 2 chairs for a full half-minute and felt something open in her chest like a window thrown wide on a spring morning. He had not asked her anything. He had not said anything. He had just built the chair and set it there, and she saw it, and she understood everything. She understood that this was not an impulsive man, that he did not speak before he had thought, did not offer before he had decided, did not ask before he knew what he was asking. He had spent these months knowing what she perhaps had also known but been too cautious to admit, and rather than press the matter or declare himself before she had any reason to trust that declaration, he had done the thing that was entirely, perfectly, entirely himself. He had built the chair, had set it there beside his own, had left it for her to see and to decide. She sat on her horse in the road and felt something move through her that was partly joy and partly the specific kind of tenderness that arrives when you realize you have been seen by someone who has taken the trouble to look carefully. She rode home without stopping. She needed to think, or rather she did not need to think at all. She had already done all the thinking, but she needed to sit with what she knew before she said it aloud. The night of the harvest program was clear and cold, the sky full of stars of the kind that appear in late October on the open prairie, as though they have been polished and set closer to the earth. The schoolhouse was warm with lanterns and bodies. Nearly every family in the county had come. The benches were packed and children in their best clothes stood in nervous rows at the back, waiting. Orville arrived early as she had asked and helped carry the platform into place, and while they worked in the last minutes before the families began arriving, they moved with the practiced ease of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. She handed him things before he asked for them. He anticipated where she was going and moved to give her space. It was not remarkable to either of them. It was simply how they worked together. When the room was ready and the families were filing in, Orville took a seat near the back. Maria stood at the front, welcoming families, directing children, managing the controlled, beautiful tumult of it all. The program was wonderful. Samuel Crane read a piece about the prairie with a voice that carried to every corner of the room, and several of the women wiped their eyes. Little Bess Whitmore, recovered from her cold, sang a folk song in a clear piping voice that brought absolute silence to the room. The children performed a short historical play about the founding of the territory that Maria had written herself, and that managed to be both educational and genuinely funny in two places, which was more than most historical plays could claim. When it was over and the families were milling and eating from the tables of pie and biscuits and cider that the town women had contributed, Maria found herself standing beside Orville at the edge of the room, both of them watching the scene with the particular satisfaction of people who had built something together. "It was a good night," he said. "It was," she agreed. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth from him in the cool air near the door, and she turned to look at him and he turned to look at her at the same moment, and she said quietly, "I saw the chair." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You just built it." "I thought it was a clearer thing to say than words," he said. She considered this. Then she said, "I think you were right." And then, because she had never been a woman who waited unnecessarily for things she had already decided, she said, "I would like to sit in it." Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but in the way that something long and carefully held finally settles into its proper place. He said, "I was hoping you'd say that." That was not the last thing said that night, but it was the most important, and they both knew it. He walked her back to the school after the families had gone and the lanterns were out, and the stars were doing their enormous, indifferent work overhead. They walked without hurrying because neither of them had anywhere urgent to be, and somewhere between the church and the school, his hand found hers in the dark and she let it stay there, and they walked the rest of the way hand in hand without saying anything about it because it did not need to be said. At her door she turned and looked at him, and he looked at her with that steadiness that she had come to understand was not reserve but attention, the fullest and most patient kind of attention, and he said, "May I come calling properly?" "On Sunday." "On Sunday," she agreed. He rode home under the stars, and she stood in her doorway watching the direction he had gone until the sound of his horse faded, and then she went inside and stood in the dark schoolroom for a while with her hand pressed to her sternum, smiling. Sunday came as Sundays do, with the particular quality of early November light that is thin and clear and makes everything look as though it has been carefully drawn. He arrived at 10 in the morning with his hat in his hand, and a small bundle wrapped in paper that turned out to be a volume of Mary Shelley that he had found at Mrs. Clayton's lending shelf and thought she might like. She thanked him and set it on her table and invited him in for coffee, and they sat on opposite sides of her small table in the school's back room and talked for 3 hours. That conversation was different from all the conversations before it. Or rather, it was the same in quality but changed in depth, as though a map that had previously shown only the surface of a country had been turned over to show the elevation as well. She told him about Gerald in Wichita, not all of it, not yet but enough, the careful misery of a man who had not been cruel in any way the law would recognize, but who had been diminishing, steadily and systematically, the way a long cold drains warmth from a room. She told him about Ohio and her mother, who had wanted her to be small and manageable, and whom she had loved anyway. She told him about the first time she had stood in front of a classroom and understood that this was the thing she was for. He listened to all of it. He did not offer comfort in the automatic way people sometimes do, did not rush to reassure or diminish. When she was done, he said, "You are one of the most complete people I have ever met," and she felt the truth of it land differently than any compliment she had received before, because it was not about her appearance or her charm or her usefulness. It was about her wholeness. Then he told her about Missouri and his family, about a father who had been decent but distracted, and a mother who had been extraordinary and had died young, about learning carpentry from an uncle who had very little patience but great skill, and how the impatience had bothered him at the time, but in retrospect the skill had stuck. He told her about coming to Kansas and choosing this piece of land beside the road with the cottonwood trees, because something about the eastern light in the mornings through that stand of trees had looked to him like the kind of thing worth building around. "I've always thought about this place as something waiting to be completed," he said. He said it looking at his coffee cup, not at her, with the careful honesty of a man saying a thing he has thought about for a long time. She looked at him with the full force of everything she knew and felt and had been unwilling to say too soon, and said, "I know that feeling." He looked up. They did not say anything else for a moment, but they did not need to. The calling continued through November with the warmth and rightness of something that has been long prepared for. Sunday mornings at her table, sometimes also a Wednesday evening when her work permitted and he would bring food he had prepared. He turned out to be a careful and competent cook, which surprised her and delighted her, and she told him so, and he said with dry amusement that a man living alone either learned to feed himself adequately or suffered, and that he preferred not to suffer. "A reasonable position," she said, eating his venison stew. "I thought so," he said. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in late November after dinner, when the first real snow was falling outside the schoolroom window in the light of the lantern's small, quiet flakes, the first snow of the season. She had been telling him something about one of her students, and she turned from the window to find him already watching her with that complete, steady attention, and she stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, and then neither of them said anything, and then he reached out and touched her face with one hand and looked at her in a way that asked without asking, and she answered by leaning forward, and the rest resolved itself naturally. The snow kept falling outside. It was very quiet. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a cold one, but Maria scarcely noticed it the way she might have noticed it before. The schoolroom was warm. The students were progressing in ways that filled her with a satisfaction she had no adequate word for, and on Sundays and Wednesdays and the occasional other evening she was not alone. She sat in the second chair for the first time on a Saturday in December, when she rode out in the afternoon and found Orville on the porch reading, and he looked up and she dismounted and he said nothing, just waited, and she tied Rosie and walked up the porch steps and sat in the second chair beside his, and they sat there together in the cold late afternoon light looking at the road and the prairie and the enormous sky. She tucked her hands in her coat and said, "These are very well-made chairs." "I know," he said. "The second one especially," she said. He said nothing, but she heard the smile in his silence. They sat there until the cold became too much, and then he made coffee and they went inside, and she looked around at his house, which she had been inside several times now, but not in this way, not with this understanding between them that made everything look different, look like it was already partly hers, and she felt a deep and specific rightness that she had not felt in a long time. That winter they learned each other fully, in the way that two people learn each other when they are both serious and deliberate through long conversations and comfortable silences, through the small revelations of preference and habit, through disagreements navigated with more honesty than pride, and through the discovery of where they thought alike and where they thought differently, and that both kinds of difference were interesting rather than threatening. She learned that he was deeply patient with most things, but genuinely impatient with dishonesty. That he had a quiet humor that was so dry it was sometimes invisible until a moment after he had said the thing, when it arrived like the punchline of a very long and well-constructed joke. That he cared about the land in a way that was almost philosophical, not as property, but as something he was in relationship with, something that required attention and reciprocity. He learned that she was fearless about most things but not about permanence, that the part of her that had been diminished by Gerald in Wichita was the part that had learned to suspect anything that asked her to stay, as though staying were always the beginning of the wrong kind of trap. He did not press or reassure. He simply continued being exactly what he was: consistent, present, unfailingly himself, until the fear lost its argument against the evidence. January brought harder weather and also an incident that required them both in a way neither had quite expected. A family named Beaumont, who homesteaded 12 miles south of town, lost their barn to a fire started by a lightning strike during a winter electrical storm, which was rare enough to seem impossible but happened nonetheless. The barn had taken 2 seasons of cattle with it, not to mention feed supplies and equipment. The Beaumonts had 3 children under 10 and nothing to replace what they had lost. The town organized, as frontier towns do, with the particular efficiency of communities who know that the next disaster could just as easily be their own. Maria organized a school fundraiser, the children performing again, this time a winter program she put together in 2 weeks rather than 2 months, on the strength of what she had learned from the harvest program. Orville organized the building effort, coordinating 6 men with lumber and tools, planning the new barn structure with the same careful precision he brought to his own work. They worked in parallel and together, and on the day the new barn was raised, with half the county in attendance and the children running between the adults' legs and the women setting out more food than anyone could reasonably eat, Maria stood beside Orville watching the frame go up against the winter sky and felt a particular fullness in her chest that was not unlike the feeling of a very good sentence completing itself. "You're good at this," she said. "Not just the building, the organizing, the people." "You're better at the people," he said. "We're good together," she said, and heard what she was actually saying and let him hear it too. He looked at her, then back at the barn frame. "Yes," he said, "we are." On an evening in late February, when the worst of the winter was deciding to loosen its hold, and the days were stretching out by minutes, Orville came to the school after the children had gone with a basket that contained supper and a small box made of a beautiful dark-grained walnut that she had never seen him work with before. She set aside the lesson preparation she had been doing and looked at the box on her table. It was the size of a large book. The wood was polished to a deep shine, and along the lid he had carved a design that she had to look at for a moment before she recognized it. It was the view from his porch, the road and the cottonwood trees and the line of the prairie, in miniature and exquisite. "Open it," he said. Inside was a ring. Not a purchased ring from a catalog. He would not have done that, but a ring he had made himself, she realized immediately, from silver. A simple band with a small, careful design worked into its surface that matched the design of the box. She looked at the ring and then at him, and he was watching her with that complete attention, and he said, "Maria, I would like to ask you something I should probably have gotten around to sooner." She laughed, just a little, because the tension required it. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I know that what I'm asking is for you to stay. I know that staying has not always been. I know what you've told me about what staying became before. I want you to know that I have thought about this more carefully than I have thought about almost anything in my life, and what I am asking is not for you to give anything up. I am asking you to add something. I am asking if you will let this be yours. The porch, the chairs, the whole thing." She looked at the ring and the box and the man standing in her schoolroom in the February evening, and thought of the second chair, and the way she had felt when she saw it on the road in the October light. And she thought of all the mornings and evenings and cold days and warm days since. And she thought of Ohio and Wichita and the long road west that had ended here, in this schoolroom, in this town, with this man. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment before she stepped forward and held his face in both her hands and kissed him. And he pulled her in close and held her with the particular steadiness of a man who has no intention of letting go. They were married on the first Saturday in April of 1879, which was exactly 1 year and 3 days after Maria Morgan had ridden into Caldwell with $4.32 and a letter of employment and a bruise she had no intention of explaining. The wedding was held at the church and attended by the greater part of the county, because both of them had become people the county felt ownership of in the particular warm way that small communities feel ownership of people they have watched become important to each other. Eleanor Dowd cried, which she had been doing at intervals for 2 weeks in anticipation. Samuel Crane attended in a suit that was slightly too short in the arms because he had grown considerably over the winter, and his mother had not had time to let the sleeves down, and he stood very straight to compensate. Little Bess Whitmore was in the front row between her parents and watched the whole ceremony with the expression of someone who had decided this was the most important event she had yet attended, and she was probably right. The minister, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Caleb Marsh, who had the useful quality of making his ceremonies feel like a genuine occasion rather than a formality, read from the Song of Solomon and from a piece of Ecclesiastes, and then he said some words of his own that were quiet and honest, and did not reach too far for sentiment because the thing itself was already full of it. When he said, "You may kiss your bride," Orville touched her face the same way he had on that first winter evening in the snowlight, with the same question in it, and she gave the same answer, and the room full of people made a sound that is the particular sound of a community recognizing something true. They left the reception as the evening settled into a sky full of cold spring stars, in Orville's wagon loaded with things from the schoolroom, which was now being inherited by a new teacher the town had found, a young man named Peter Ashe who had come from Lawrence, and who had already been briefed by Maria in considerable detail on the particular needs and gifts of each of her 22 students. She had said goodbye to the classroom that morning with a thoroughness and a grief that she had not expected to feel as strongly as she did. The classroom had been hers in a way that nothing had been hers for a very long time before it, entirely hers, made by her work and her intention, leaving it even for something she was running toward rather than away from required something of her. But she had said goodbye, and she had walked out into the April morning and climbed into the wagon beside Orville, and he had looked at her and understood without her saying a word, because he always did, and he had not made it smaller or said anything at all, but had simply let her feel what she was feeling as they drove east along the road toward the place that was now hers as well as his. The house was the same house it had always been, but different in the specific way that all spaces are different when you enter them changed. She walked through the rooms and he walked with her, and she saw it all: the kitchen with the good wood stove, the bedroom with the east window that would give her the morning light he had known she would want when he had first chosen this land, the workshop behind the house where he made the things he made, the vegetable garden now just beginning to show its spring promises, and the porch with the 2 chairs. She sat in hers and he sat in his, and they watched the late afternoon light come across the prairie in the long golden waves that the flat Kansas land specializes in, and she thought that she had spent a long time moving west toward something she could not name until she found it. And here it was, this porch, this man, this pair of chairs set side by side looking at the world together. "I think this might be enough," she said. He looked at her. "Might be," he said with that dry edge that made her smile every time. She said, "I think this is enough." "Good," he said, "because I have not the slightest intention of making it less." She laughed and reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand over his, and they sat like that until the sky went pink and then dark, and the first stars came out one at a time, as though being introduced. The spring and summer of 1879 were the first full seasons of their life together on the property, and they were filled with the specific satisfactions of two people learning to share a space and a life. The negotiations of habit, the discoveries of preference, the pleasure of routines becoming theirs together rather than separately. She took over the management of the kitchen garden with an intensity that surprised them both, and within a season she had it producing more than they could use, which meant preserving jars of things that lined the cellar shelves with the colors of summer locked inside them. He was building a new piece of furniture for the bedroom, a proper chest of drawers, and she would often sit in the workshop in the evenings while he worked, reading or preparing lesson plans for the occasional tutoring she still did, because she had not entirely been able to give up teaching and had arranged to continue working with 4 students privately, including Bess Whitmore, who had a gift for language that Maria felt a particular responsibility toward. The injustice of Bernard Holt continued to sit in the county's consciousness through that summer, because the Crane case had been only one of many, and while Holt had been checked, he had not been fully stopped. He was careful now, more careful, and he had changed his methods enough that the law found it harder to catch him cleanly. 3 more families north of Caldwell were in various stages of debt pressure, and Maria and Orville continued to work in the combination they had found, she organizing the community response, he providing the legal and structural knowledge that gave it traction. In August, the county marshal, a serious man named Elias Dowd, who happened to be Alina's husband, found sufficient evidence in Holt's most recent transaction to bring a formal complaint to the county court. Orville had spent 3 weeks helping Elias document the pattern of Holt's operations, the systematic nature of it, in a way that the court could not dismiss. Maria had gathered signed statements from 6 families who had been affected. The court proceeding was brief, and the finding was significant. Bernard Holt was found to have operated in violation of territorial lending law on no fewer than 8 documented cases, and was ordered to release all claims acquired through those transactions. He left Caldwell shortly after with considerably less than he had arrived with, and the county found it did not miss him. At the dinner the Dowd family held to celebrate, Alina stood up at the end of the meal and proposed a toast to Maria and Orville, and said that if there were 2 people in the county who proved that stubborn decency was worth something, it was the 2 of them. Maria, sitting beside Orville in the warm lamplight, felt him press her hand under the table, and she pressed back, and they looked at each other for a moment with the particular look of 2 people who have walked through something difficult together and come out the other side. Fall arrived and brought with it a pregnancy that Maria discovered in October of 1879, with a mixture of certainty and wonder that she had not been prepared for how much it would feel like both things at once. She told Orville on a Sunday evening on the porch, direct as she always was, watching his face as she said the words. The expression that moved through him was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. He was not a man who showed feeling easily, not from withholding, but from a natural reserve that she had come to understand as the container for everything rather than the absence of it. But what moved through him in that moment was unmistakable and completely unguarded, a joy so complete and genuine that it arrived on his face like sunrise. He reached across the space between the chairs and held both her hands. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, because this was the man he was and she loved him fully for it. "Very well," she said. "I'm well, Orville." He brought her hands to his lips. The winter pregnancy was a study in the contrast between how she felt internally, which was excellent, strong, carrying this new life with the same directness with which she did everything, and how the town collectively treated her, which was with a protectiveness that occasionally threatened to become comic. Alina Dowd appeared at the house every Tuesday with food. The school mothers organized a rotation of visiting. Even Samuel Crane, now 15 and almost incomprehensibly tall, stopped by one afternoon with 2 armfuls of firewood he had apparently chopped himself and deposited on the porch without anyone asking him to. Orville, through all of it, was exactly what she needed him to be: attentive without hovering, present without smothering, proud and careful and funny about it in the dry way he was funny about everything, which helped enormously. The baby arrived in June of 1880, at the very beginning of summer, as though choosing the best possible light and season to enter. A boy. A solidly built, remarkably alert baby boy with dark eyes that opened and looked around with an expression, suggesting he had opinions about the arrangement he had arrived in. They named him James, after both the attorney who had saved the Crane family's land and a quieter, private reason that Orville held from his own history that he explained to Maria one evening, a name that carried memory for him and that she accepted as a gift. James Archer was from the first day a child who reminded Maria of his father, not in any dramatic physical sense, though he had Orville's coloring and would grow to have his build, but in the quality of his attention. Even as an infant he watched things with a seriousness that was not anxious, but simply complete. He looked at the world as though he intended to understand it. The two chairs on the porch acquired a third occupant in the evenings now, a small person held between them in a basket at first, and then, as the months went by, sitting propped against cushions. And then eventually, by the time he was 2.5 years old, a small person sitting cross-legged on the porch boards between the two chairs, looking out at the road and the prairie with the same expression his parents wore, as though the view were a conversation worth participating in. The tutoring Maria had been doing through those years grew, quietly and almost without her intending it, into something more formal. By 1881 she was teaching 8 students privately, covering not only the basic curriculum but history and literature and natural philosophy and mathematics, at a level that several of the students' parents noted was considerably beyond what the school was providing. 3 of her former students, including Samuel Crane, were now at the county level preparing for the examinations that would qualify them for further schooling in Wichita or Topeka. She wrote letters on their behalf to several institutions. She argued their cases with the focused, relentless clarity she brought to anything she believed in. Samuel Crane was accepted to a law program in Topeka in the fall of 1882, and the afternoon he came to the house to tell her, he stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, "I know where this started, Miss Morgan, Mrs. Archer," catching himself with a slight flush. "I just want you to know I know," she said. "I know what you're going to do with it, Samuel. I've always known." He left with his back straighter than when he arrived, if such a thing was possible. On a Saturday in the autumn of 1882, when James was 2 years old and the cottonwood trees were turning gold and the air had that specific clean bite that preceded the first frost, Maria sat on the porch with Orville in the late afternoon and felt the particular settledness of a woman who has arrived, fully and completely, where she was meant to be. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know?" he said. "When did you decide?" she asked. "On the chair. When did you decide to build it?" He considered this with his usual patience. The light was coming through the cottonwoods at a low angle, breaking into long pieces across the yard. James was inside, having recently discovered the particular pleasure of stacking and then demolishing towers of wooden blocks that Orville had made for him, and they could hear the intermittent sound of successful construction followed by gleeful destruction. "February," Orville said, "when you came to me about the Crane family and we sat on the porch and talked. You used the stool and I sat in the chair, and the whole conversation I kept thinking, that is where someone ought to sit, not on a stool. In a chair made for staying." She looked at him. "February," she said, "that was 2 months after you met me." "I know," he said. "I told you I was not quick to speak. I didn't say I was slow to see." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the yard and into the cottonwood trees and the prairie and the enormous blue Kansas sky. He reached over and touched her hand. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in the 2 chairs side by side while the afternoon light moved across the land, and the stack of blocks inside crashed again with a sound of absolute 2-year-old triumph. The second child came in the spring of 1883, and this time it was a girl. They named her Clara, after Orville's mother, the extraordinary woman who had died young and whose loss Orville carried with the quiet private grief of a man who had never found a way to set it down. When he held Clara for the first time, that first hour in the bedroom with the east window light coming in, Maria watched his face and saw something resolve in him that she understood without him having to explain, not the grief leaving, but the grief finding a place to rest. Clara was, in all ways, her mother's daughter from the start. She had Maria's dark eyes and Maria's particular brand of fearlessness, and by the time she was 3, a vocabulary and a precision of expression that had the county women saying she would be a schoolteacher like her mother. Maria said she would be whatever she decided to be, and meant it. The homestead grew in the years that followed with the specific organic growth of a place that is genuinely cared for. Orville expanded the vegetable garden based on what Maria had learned made it productive. He added a room to the east side of the house, a proper study for her, with built-in shelves that lined 3 walls, enough for every book she had accumulated and every book she intended to acquire. It was the best room in the house, and she told him so. "Good," he said. "It should be." She watched him build it and thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular privilege in being loved by someone who expressed love with their hands. Every shelf, every joint, every piece of this house and this life bore the marks of his care made visible. The school in town went through a succession of teachers through those years, some good and some less so, and Maria was always available to the school board when they needed advice or to fill in during transitions. And there was a particular period in 1884 when the current teacher took ill, and Maria took over the classroom for 3 months, bringing James and Clara with her. James now old enough to sit quietly in the back and work on his reading. Clara not quite old enough, but managing through the grace of personality. She stood in front of 26 children that spring. The class had grown with the town, and felt the old satisfaction of it, the irreplaceable specific pleasure of watching a mind arrive at something it had not previously been able to reach, and she thought that she had not left this after all. She had only taken it home with her, which was perhaps where it had always wanted to be. In the evenings she and Orville sat on the porch in the chairs he had built, one at first and then 2, and talked about the day and the children and the land and the things they were reading and the state of the territory, which was building itself with the particular intensity of a place that knows it is becoming something and is not yet sure what. Kansas would apply for statehood. That was the constant conversation in those years, the question of statehood and what it would mean for land rights and territory governance and the lives of the people who had built themselves into this place. Orville had opinions, careful and well considered. Maria had opinions, direct and plainly stated. They did not always agree, and this was one of the things that made their life together not just comfortable but interesting. A life without argument was a life without thinking, and neither of them was willing to stop thinking. They argued about politics and land policy and education funding, and whether the railroad expansion was a good thing overall or a complex thing with good and bad components distributed unevenly. And they argued about whether James should be sent to school in Topeka when he was old enough or educated at home. And they argued about the proper way to put up green beans, which was not a large matter, but which they each held opinions about, with an intensity that amused them both when they stopped to notice it. They never argued about anything that mattered between them, which was not because nothing mattered, but because they had built between them a thing that was too well made to crack under ordinary pressure. By the middle of 1885, the property had reached a kind of completion that felt, like most arrivals, like the beginning of the next thing. James was 5, serious and curious, and already showing the talent for working with his hands that his father had, spending hours in the workshop watching Orville work and asking questions of extraordinary precision for a 5-year-old. Clara was 2, and the word that best described her was unstoppable in every possible application of that term. One evening in October of that year, with the harvest in and the cellar full and the children asleep and the last of the summer's warmth still present in the air after dark, Maria and Orville sat on the porch in the chairs and watched a meteor streak across the black sky to the north, a brief bright line that was there and then gone. "When I was coming from Wichita," Maria said, "I did not believe that I would find this." "What did you think you would find?" he asked. "Work," she said. "A classroom. Something to do that was worth doing. I thought that would be enough." And now, she turned and looked at him in the dark. He was watching her with that complete attention she had never stopped being moved by, that quality of looking at her as though she were the thing most worth looking at in any room she was in. "Now I know that I was not wrong that it would be enough," she said. "I was only wrong that it would be all there was." He reached across, and she met him halfway, and they held hands in the dark as the stars continued their indifferent and beautiful work overhead, and the porch with its 2 chairs held them both in the cool October night, and the house behind them was full of the breathing silence of sleeping children and the smell of wood smoke, and the knowledge of all the work and love that had made it what it was. The following spring, Maria planted a row of rose bushes along the front fence, yellow roses, which were her mother's flower and which she had wanted for years, but had not thought to ask for until she realized, with the particular surprise of happiness, that she could have the things she had simply been unable to ask for in a previous life. She could plant roses. She could write to Ohio for bulbs and plant them and watch them grow and cut them in summer and put them in a glass jar on the table of the study with the bookshelves, and the whole of it would be entirely, simply, unreservedly hers. Orville built a trellis for them along the fence without being asked, because he had seen her plant them and had thought, as he always thought, about what they would need. By 1886, the town of Caldwell had grown from the town she had arrived in to something more established, more substantial, a place with 2 churches and a bank, and a proper school building with enough room for 30 students and a teaching staff of 2. Maria sat on the school board by then, the only woman to do so, a position she had been nominated to by Elias Dowd and seconded by Samuel Crane, who had returned from Topeka with a law degree and had set up practice in Caldwell with the stated intention of making himself useful to people who could not otherwise afford counsel, which was, in his experience, most of the people who needed it most. Maria was a rigorous board member who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to let important things be buried under procedural language, and the other board members respected her the way people respect someone who makes their work better even when it makes it harder. At a board meeting in November of 1886, when the discussion turned to the question of expanding the school's curriculum, Maria made a proposal that she had been working on for 3 years. A structured program of continuing education for adults, using the school building on evenings and weekends, covering reading and numeracy and practical skills, open to anyone in the county who wanted to attend regardless of background or circumstance. There were objections, as there are always objections to things worth doing. Maria addressed each one with the patient, meticulous preparation she had always brought to arguments she intended to win. The program was approved. It began in January of 1887 with 12 adult students in the evening classroom, and Maria taught 3 of the sessions herself. By spring, it had 28. Orville attended the carpentry skills session. She organized and contributed demonstrations that were so thorough and well received that the participants requested he come back the following month. He did. Watching him teach that evening, explaining the properties of different woods with the same unhurried clarity he brought to everything, showing the young man beside him how to read the grain with his hand, Maria thought that she had somehow known, even in the first weeks, that he was this kind of man. A man whose quality ran all the way through. On a morning in the early spring of 1887, she woke before he did, which was unusual because he was habitually first awake. She lay still and listened to the quiet of the house, and the faint prairie wind moving through the cottonwood trees, the specific sound of those trees that she had come to associate with home in the most uncomplicated possible sense. Not the complicated, ambivalent home of childhood or the provisional home of the traveling years, but the settled, built, chosen home of a life that had been made on purpose. She heard James moving in his room. He was 7 now and woke early, a habit he shared with his father, and she heard Clara, 5 years old, already beginning to wake with the particular decisive energy she brought to everything. And she thought about the day ahead, which was a Tuesday, which meant she would work with her tutoring students in the morning and attend to board business in the afternoon, and come home in the evening to the house and the family and the porch in the October light. She turned and looked at Orville sleeping beside her and felt, with the full force of a love that had been building and deepening for 9 years now, since that first spring afternoon when she had ridden up to the gate and found him working wood in the yard, that this was the life she had been riding toward without knowing it. She was not a woman given to tears, but she felt something in her eyes, and she let it be, because there was no one watching and she had earned it. He opened his eyes and found her watching him and said, "You're staring." "I am," she agreed without apology. "Something on your mind?" he asked in the tone of a man who already knows the answer but wants to give it room. "Everything that matters," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with that complete and steady attention that had been the first thing she had trusted about him, and that 9 years had not diminished by a single degree. "Good," he said. "Me too." He reached out and brushed the hair from her face, a gesture so ordinary and so full that she felt it in her chest, and she covered his hand with hers, and they lay there together in the early light while the cottonwoods moved in the wind and the children began their day, and the porch waited outside with the 2 chairs facing the road and the prairie and the enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky, 2 chairs built by careful hands, set side by side, made for staying, made for this. In the years that followed, the community of Caldwell continued to grow and change around them, and Maria and Orville grew and changed with it, which is the honest way of things. Orville's woodworking business expanded in 1888 when he took on an apprentice, a 16-year-old boy named Will Patterson whose father had recently died, and who had no particular direction until he stood in Orville's workshop and found one. Maria watched Orville teach Will with the same close attention and high standards that had characterized his own learning, and Will Patterson became, within 3 years, a skilled craftsman in his own right, another thing built with care in Caldwell, Kansas. Samuel Crane married a woman named Abigail in 1889, and Maria and Orville attended the wedding with James, and Clara dressed in their best and behaving with approximately the level of decorum that could reasonably be expected from 2 children who were fundamentally interested in everything, and found weddings particularly full of interesting things. James, 9 years old, stood in the church with a solemnity that was entirely real. He had already formed the view that serious occasions deserved serious attention. Clara, 7, whispered questions throughout the ceremony in Maria's ear, all of them excellent, and none of them answerable in a whisper. The summer of 1890 brought a heat wave that tested the county with the single-minded thoroughness that Kansas weather reserved for its extremes, and brought also a 3rd pregnancy, announced by Maria on a Wednesday evening on the porch in the specific matter-of-fact way she announced everything. Orville's face did the thing it had done twice before, that complete unguarded sunrise of a thing, that openness that only this brought out of him, and he took her hand and held it the same way he always had. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. The 3rd child was a boy, born in March of 1891, and they named him William, though they called him Will, and within a year it was clear that of the 3 children, he was the one who had come out most purely himself from the very beginning, with a laugh that could fill a room and an appetite for the world that made his parents look at each other sometimes with expressions of wondering joy, and also, if they were honest, occasional exhausted awe. Clara took her role as older sister to Will with a seriousness that would have been appropriate to a diplomatic appointment, and the authority she exercised over him was so complete and so affectionately exercised that Will accepted it as the natural order of things throughout his childhood and likely much longer. James, at 11, was already talking about buildings. Not carpentry but architecture, the larger shape of structures, the way spaces were organized, what made a room feel the way it felt. He spent hours drawing. He had his father's hands and his mother's mind, and the combination was already producing something that neither of them could quite predict, and both of them were deeply interested to watch develop. On an evening in the fall of 1893, Orville built a third chair for the porch. He brought it out on a Saturday afternoon and set it beside the other two, and when Maria came out and saw it, she stopped and looked at it and felt the echo of that October afternoon in 1878, so clearly it was almost physical: the road, the porch, the two chairs, the understanding. "James wants to sit on the porch more," Orville said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that quality that had never changed, that complete attention, that slight warmth behind the steady eyes. "Just James?" she asked. He thought about it. "The other two won't be far behind," he said. She laughed and went to sit in her chair, and James came out 5 minutes later and settled into the new one as though it had always been there, as though the porch had always been organized with exactly this in mind, and perhaps it had. Clara and young Will claimed their place on the porch boards between the chairs in the evenings, and the family of 5 sat in the settling autumn light, while the cottonwoods turned gold, and the road ran east and west, and the prairie went on toward the horizon in every direction with the beautiful indifference of a thing that has been here longer than any of them and will be here after. The years continued in the way that good years continue, not without difficulty, because that is not how years work, but with the particular quality of a life that is structurally sound, that can bear weight, that flexes rather than cracks under pressure. There were droughts and hard winters. There were moments of fear and loss. Eleanor Dowd died in 1895, and the grief of that moved through the community, and through Maria in particular, with the weight of losing someone who had been genuinely kind when kindness had been needed. The funeral was on a cold November morning, and Maria sat beside Orville in the church pew and held his hand and let herself feel all of it, because she had learned with him and from him that feeling things fully was not weakness but a form of honesty. Elias Dowd lived another 8 years after Eleanor, and Maria looked in on him regularly, which was nothing more and nothing less than what Eleanor would have done. In 1897, James Archer left Caldwell for Kansas City to study architecture formally, carrying with him a letter of recommendation that Maria had written with every word she had, and a toolbox from Orville that contained the first set of chisels Orville himself had owned, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather cord. James stood on the porch the morning of his departure and looked at his parents with the expression of a young man who is leaving but is not broken away, who is departing from the right place and therefore able to go. He was 17 years old, and he looked more himself than he had ever looked. Maria hugged him and said, "Right. Every week," he said. Orville shook his hand and then pulled him in and held him briefly, the way men of that time and place held their sons, briefly and completely, and let him go. He wrote every week. Every single week for years, without fail, the letters arriving at the Caldwell post and coming home in Maria's coat pocket, read aloud at the kitchen table in the evenings, read and reread and saved in the box with the carved porch view that still sat on the study shelf, still as beautiful as the day Orville had given it to her. Clara left for Wichita in 1899, at 18, to attend the teachers' college that had been established there, a choice her mother celebrated, and her father noted with the dry observation that apparently the teaching gene was more durable than the furniture gene. Though he said this looking at the chair he was currently repairing with a warmth that contradicted the complaint. Young Will, at 9, was very much still present and filling the house with the particular energy of a child, who is the youngest of 3, and has absorbed the full benefit and the full intensity of his family's attention. He was funny in a way that was already sophisticated for his age, and he had Maria's eyes and Orville's hands and some third quality that was entirely his own. A musicality, an ear for rhythm in speech and in the world, that made his parents suspect he might be something they had not produced before. The house on the East Road was full in those years in the way that houses become full when they have been lived in with attention and love, full of the physical evidence of all the living, the shelves of books that had multiplied through every room, the collection of small wooden things Orville made and left in corners when he was working through a problem, the jar of yellow roses from the fence on the kitchen table through the summer months, the boots lined up at the door, the sound of Will playing his harmonica on the porch in the evenings. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1900, which was the 21st year of their marriage and the 22nd year since Maria Morgan had ridden into Caldwell with $4.32 and a letter of employment, she sat on the porch in her chair while Orville sat in his, and Will was inside playing his harmonica with the dreamy half-attention of a 10-year-old who has discovered he can reproduce any melody he hears after one listening. And the prairie was doing what it always did in the spring evenings, going gold and then rose and then slowly, softly dark. "I was thinking today," she said, "about the road from Wichita." He looked at her. He was 52 years old, and the years had done to him what years do to men who have worked with their hands in weather, had made him lined and solid and more himself, somehow, in the way that good wood becomes more itself with age rather than less. "What about it?" he said. "I was trying to remember what I was thinking when I came into town that first morning," she said. "What I expected. And I expected a classroom," she said. "I expected to be useful and to be left alone to do my work and not to need anything more than that." "Reasonable expectations," he said. "Completely wrong as it turned out," she said. He made a sound that was his dry laughter, and she smiled because she would never stop hearing that sound without smiling. It was one of the fixed and permanent things. "I kept thinking about this place," she said. "I thought about it for weeks after I first came out here. One chair on the porch. I thought it was sad at first. One chair, and then I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know why." "And now?" he asked. "Now I know that it was not sad," she said. "It was waiting." He looked at her with everything, with 22 years of knowing her, with the memory of the day she had first ridden up to his gate, and he had put down his draw knife and straightened and looked at her, and understood within 5 minutes that something had arrived that he had not been expecting, with the memory of February and the conversation on the porch where he had looked at the stool she was sitting on and thought, "A chair, I need to build her a chair," with the memory of April and the wedding and every evening since. "Waiting," he said. "Waiting for the right person to come along the road," she said. "That's all, just waiting." He reached across the arm of his chair and she reached across the arm of hers, and their hands met in the space between, and they held on in the spring evening while the last light went off the prairie, and the stars began one by one to appear, and Will's harmonica inside played something that neither of them knew the name of, but that sounded like everything they had made together, imperfect in all the right places, and full and genuinely beautiful. The chairs held them. The house stood behind them. The cottonwood trees moved in the evening breeze, making their particular sound, the sound that meant home. The road ran east and west in the last light, empty now. The day's travelers all arrived somewhere for the night. And in the full, quiet, settled peace of everything they had built together, Maria and Orville Archer sat on their porch as they had sat on so many evenings, and watched the stars come out, and were exactly where they were supposed to be, exactly who they had become together, with the whole of their good and chosen life around them, closed and complete and more than enough.